That is a great transition over to the Montreal Canadiens. You did mention the Tyler Toffoli trade. He was shipped away by the Montreal Canadiens, and their general manager, Kent Hughes, spoke about, he briefly mentioned the Toffoli trade, but also spoke a lot about Ben Chiarot at his press conference on Wednesday. If the right deal's there, they'll make it with Ben Chiarot. And the same sort of applies to Jeff Petrie. What have you heard about Ben Chiarot and the interest in him? And could he be moved maybe as soon as maybe today? Maybe there's a world where he could be traded by the time you are listening to this podcast.
There definitely is that world. I mean, the Canadiens have been pretty clear they want sort of a David Savard-like return from last year's deadline, which was a first and a third, I believe, but a first plus another, asset. If someone meets that price, I think that they'll make that move. Ben Chiarot had kind of a minor injury in a game over the weekend, but it just underlines when you have an asset that's as in demand as he's been all year. There have been teams that have, because the Canadian season has been headed in a certain direction from pretty much go. I think teams have wanted to get a handle on the Chiarot situation. There haven't really been contract discussions with the Canadiens. It's sort of been clear he's moving towards being traded before the deadline, but you don't want to risk, having that asset get injured beforehand. So I wouldn't surprise to see this trade happen within a week's time. Just depends if one of these teams kicking around is willing to meet that sort of price and make the deal happen. It could be a prospect type deal too. I think one thing the Canadiens liked about the trade they made with Calgary is they got, that prospect Heineman. I don't know the correct pronunciation, but he's drafted 2 years ago. He's a little closer potentially to being ready to help you at the NHL level. And so it's not necessarily that they need a first and a third for Chiarot. Maybe it's a first and a similar type of prospect from another team. But, it's a pretty hefty price. And I do think Canes have a lot of balls in the air, but Chiarot is the one I'm most confident that they're going to move. I think they consider Mike Hoffman, Jonathan Drouin, even Christian Dvorak. I think they'd look at moving if they could. But, Chiarot is the more natural piece to move just because he plays a specific style game. He's on an expiring contract. The cap hit isn't too onerous, and there are lots of good teams that want to acquire him.
What about the teams interested in Ben Chiarot? I hear there's like a whole bunch of teams interested in the guy, or maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, it's a bunch of teams that are at least kicking around, having those conversations. I mean, Calgary tried to trade for him on the weekend when they were doing the Toffoli deal. So, there was a world where that was a much bigger trade. The teams couldn't see eye to eye on how that would fit together and ultimately severed off. And Toffoli was more of the Flames' priority because they felt they needed scoring. But so Calgary's there. Maybe they get back into it. We'll see. I mean, they've won 8 in a row as we're recording this. Clearly fancy themselves as contenders or a team that could make a move. And they're in a division that I think has a soft edge to it right now. So why not go for it? Florida's been connected to him. St. Louis, I think, has had interest in Chiarot. The Maple Leafs, I know, have called on him a fair bit, and some believe that they might be, perhaps even the front runner or one of the front runners to land him. I think it's interesting. Every team has different needs. Like these teams with the teams without much cap space would probably rather this deal happen closer to March 21st. The Canadiens wanting to protect their asset, might be more willing to deal him soon. I mean, that's part of the dynamic there too. But I'm sure there's teams I haven't mentioned that as well that are in the mix. And really, I think he's an easy player for a lot of teams to take on just because his cap hit's a little over $3 million, and the Canadiens are willing to retain half of his contract. They've let everyone calling know that they're willing to take on 50%. And so you're talking about potentially someone who can make an impact, and he does so on relatively, small cap hit.
Okay, that's a lot to take in on Chiarot. So 2 big takeaways. There's a growing sense that the Toronto Maple Leafs, who everyone on the SDP were basically spending half the podcast being like, please don't get Ben Chiarot. Please don't get Ben Chiarot. There's a growing sense the Leafs could be the front runner. And I don't know if that was out there at all, but the Canadiens are willing to retain salary on Ben Chiarot. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
The second one is right. They're definitely prepared to do that if you want. Obviously there's probably a little bit more of a premium on what you pay if that's what you're getting. Don't radio me on my own podcast. I did use the word front runner, but what I mean is I think to be more specific and more clear, Steve, Adam, Jesse,
That's why I'm asking. Because they're going to mention it on the Friday show. That's why.
Well, don't clip the first one. clip this. The Leafs have seem to have a high degree of interest in it. But they're not alone. Like that's Toronto gets us probably the clicks if we use that, but they're not the only team. Like I think the Blues are quite interested as well in Chiarot, and there's a few others. So it's not. And Calgary already tried to trade for him. So someone could come out of the dark here. Something could materialize with a team we're not mentioning. But there's a sense that the Leafs have been interested the whole time. I think it makes sense for Toronto on some levels. I understand everyone's concern. You can pull up the player cards that everyone bounces around Twitter these days. The numbers don't look too good. Ben Chiarot also played with Shea Weber last year on a team that went to the Stanley Cup final. And that's a year ago. Maybe things have declined, but I think in a better situation can be part of a useful pairing for a team that plays a long time in the playoffs. And I think the Leafs are looking to make it a move on their blue line. It might not end up being that significant as Chiarot, might be someone more depth-wise, but the Leafs are looking at everything. I think they're willing to be creative, and they're definitely looking at Chiarot to some degree.
Since you do focus a fair bit on the Leafs, can you give us a sense of what they might be looking at right now beyond Ben Chiarot, or any other pieces or any other needs they might be looking to fill ahead of the deadline?
Well, at the risk of jumping too deep into minutia, they basically have no cap space. They claimed Adam Brooks off waivers yesterday from Vegas, a player they drafted and have had in their organization before, and then they had to send Timothy Liljegren to the Marlies, to the HL, just to be cap compliant. And so, as we're recording this, it almost feels like you don't know how they acquire anybody. Now, the beauty is there still is a few weeks, and there's players on their roster I think they're willing to move. Obviously, Nick Ritchie's contract is buried in the minors right now, but it counts against their cap, and he's someone they're trying to move before the deadline to create some room. But it's hard to get a handle on exactly what they might be able to do because they really have no cap room today. Now, thing is that they play a game tonight, they play a game on Saturday. Like you could have an injury between now and the deadline that makes that point moot. If one of their high earning players goes on long-term injured reserve, they might have $10 million, in cap space in which they could use to acquire a player at the deadline. So, they're obviously in on a bunch of defensemen in terms of just gauging the market and being ready to react. I think that's probably internally the number one priority, but their needs could sort of evolve and adjust based on what happens to the team. And there's still a number of games from the play before March 21st.